is one of my favorite songs. I intend for that song to be sung at my funeral, but I intend for all these three people to be so old they can't do it. But I am undone by the mercy of Jesus. I am overwhelmed to think this morning I can stand here and say I am right with God. I have nothing within me that deserves that, but it is by His grace and by His mercy. Y'all give me a minute. We have been looking about some heroes of the faith in the Old Testament, and I love it whenever God does extraordinary things and He uses just ordinary people. And these are the stories. We have looked at the story of Gideon, a man who was so afraid that they were going to come and take his lunch money even, that he was down in the threshing floor and the Lord appeared to him. And he said, if the Lord be for us, why is all this befallen us? And a man who had filled with so many questions and said the odds are all against us, and yet God lived out where He got it to the point where it was impossible that men could take the credit for the victory, and God gave them a victory. Hundreds of thousands against some 300 of Gideon. Wonderful story. Then we have looked at another story about a woman in the Bible whose name was Esther. And in the story of Esther, you find this Jewish girl in a foreign land, and she's not sure of herself about what she can do, but it was through her life and through the hero of Mordecai that she was there to serve God at such a time as this. And we learned that God can take just a simple little girl who was put in a position, and God saved the Jewish people from a Holocaust in the story of Esther. This morning we come to the story of Ruth. And Ruth is one of the most intriguing stories in all of literature, but certainly in the Bible as well. In Esther, you learn about a Jewish girl who marries a Gentile, and that in her royal position, she's able to save the Jewish people. In Ruth, you learn where a Gentile girl marries a Jewish man, and that God uses her and puts her in the messianic line of royalty also to save the Jewish people, and even more so to save all who would trust in that Messiah. So we're going to look this morning at this beautiful love story. You will not find a greater human love story than is found in the book of Ruth. Some have said as well, it is just a wonderful piece of literature for our students. I want to challenge you. You will be in classes even now and even a few years from now probably, where you will study literature, and you will have to take a short story and write a paper on a short story. I would challenge you maybe to consider the book of Ruth, one of the greatest short stories in all of literature, and to be able to see how God works through that. So we're going to look this morning, and it's kind of difficult. If you know about the book of Ruth, then you're going to hear some things you're familiar with. But if you don't know anything about the book of Ruth, then there's some things you have to understand culturally to make application. So we'll start in the book of Ruth. If you'll turn there, Ruth chapter 1, and beginning in verse 1. You have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and then Ruth. So it's in the front part of the Old Testament, and we pick it up in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1, and we're going to look at the timing, the setting, the characters, and then some of the redemptive qualities that are seen through some traditions you have to understand, but the principles that still apply for us. So look there, Ruth chapter 1 and verse 1. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his two sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her two sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Palin and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereaved of her 2 children and her husband. Just to understand this background, look at the timing, the setting, the characters of the story. The timing, as it's spelled out there in chapter 1 and verse 1, it's during the era of the judges. You may remember this is from the time before the monarchy, after they have conquered the promised land, but before the monarchy of the kings. And during this 400-year period of time, the children of Israel just are repeating a bad cycle. And they repeat it some 7 times over that 400 years. Let me just sort of spell out. They were blessed by God. They were in the promised land, but they would stray away from their covenant agreement with God. And they would go off after false gods, and they would worship false gods, and they would do things contrary to God's law and contrary to their covenant. And so God would send them warning after warning and prophets, and they would say, you need to come back to the Lord, but they wouldn't. So then there was, from that rebellion, then there was the time of what's called retribution. Whenever God sends judgment to them, whenever God sends some enemy, as he did with Gideon, that's coming in, and some army, or maybe it's through, as it is here, through a famine, some disaster, and God is trying to wake them up to the reality that they're not living the way that they should. So it's that time of retribution. They do wake up, and usually that cycle goes that they will repent. They will say, my goodness, look at what we're doing. Look at the consequences of it, and they turn to the Lord, and that leads them to a time of peace. And then it all starts over again. It's a bad cycle. Over those 400 years, they went through that some 7 times. That's where they are right now. And whenever you read that they're in a famine, it's not just a weather thing. It is because they have strayed away from God. They're not fulfilling their part of the covenant, and so God gets their attention. So the timing of this in the day of the judges, you kind of see the attitude of that. You go to the last chapter, the last verse in the book of Judges, and you see kind of what their attitude is. It says in Judges 21:25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And everybody is doing what pleases themselves. That is a bad way to live your life, because you're never going to find satisfaction. And that's what's going on in the nation of Israel. So that is the timing of that. Look again, if you will, and you find the setting of this. They are in a famine, a bad famine, because they're not following their part of the covenant. So they decide in chapter 1 that they're going to get up and go to Moab. It may not mean a whole lot to you unless you know a little bit of history about Moab. God tells them, whenever you stray away from me, I'm going to get your attention. Deuteronomy chapter 11 in verses 16 and 17 says, beware that your hearts are not deceived, and that you do not turn away and serve other gods and worship them, or the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there'll be no rain. That's what's going on. They're not following after God. Their hearts are turned away from him, so he sends them a famine. And so Elimelech and his wife and children, he says, you know what? We heard that things are okay over in Moab, so we're going to get up from where we are and we're going to go to Moab. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? We don't have anything to eat here and everything's going great over there. Let's pick up from where we are here and go to where there's food over there. Well, it may sound like a good idea unless you don't realize Moab's not the place that the children of Israel want to go. They are the enemies of the Israelites. They're going into a foreign land. They're going into land that is contrary to everything that they stand for or that they should stand for. If you want to know just a little bit about the Moabites, led the children of Israel into sexual immorality, led them to follow after Baal, led them into all sorts of sin, and so this is where they're going. They pick up from where they are at Bethlehem, and they go north through Jerusalem, and they go about 100 miles, cross over at Jericho, and cross over the Jordan, and they are in Moab. But the Moabites are their enemies. Let me give you just a little taste of why. Moab, the father of the Moabites, he was the son of an incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughter. Remember whenever Lot in Sodom was leaving and they got him drunk and his daughters came in and slept with him. And so they've always had a contention. Matter of fact, there's a judgment upon them. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord, neither their descendants to the 10th generation shall enter the assembly of the Lord. It's kind of interesting whenever you trace generations from Moab to Ruth. Verse 4, this is why. Because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam. Whenever the children of Israel came out, before they went into the promised land, the Moabites did nothing to help them. And then if you remember another story from the Old Testament, do you remember the man Balaam? Whenever he is hired to curse the children of Israel. And he's walking along, and God opens the mouth of his donkey, the prophet and the talking donkey. That's not a Baptist preacher. That was a real thing that happened in the Old Testament. And it saved Balaam's life. The Moabites were the ones that hired him to curse Israel. They are not friends of Israel. They have a long history of doing everything against Israel, and that's where they're going. Now, names mean something in the Old Testament. Sometimes we name somebody just because we like the sound of the name. Man said, I named my son Nick. I thought of that name one morning when I was shaving. Names don't mean a whole lot sometimes, except maybe family names or those kind of things. But they did in the Bible. And I want you to think they were leaving from Bethlehem. This is important to know because sometime a preacher may give you a quiz sometime and ask you, what does the name Bethlehem mean? Does anybody know what the name Bethlehem means? Miss Louise. House of bread. That is very good. House of bread. Y'all give her a hand. She has been to Bethlehem, and Bethlehem's a beautiful place, but that's where they live. House of bread. Think of this. And they're going to Moab. Psalm 60 gives us the name of what Moab means. It says Moab is God's washpot. So they're going from the house of bread because they don't have any bread, and they're moving to God's washpot. Doesn't quite make sense. Other thing is the name Elimelech means God is my king. Well, he was not living like God was his king. The name Naomi means pleasant, but she is so miserable. Later on she says, you ought to even change my name. And then they had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and their names mean puny. I don't know if he was just a small baby or why. Puny and pining or whining. So get this picture in your head that the scripture's painting. Here, God is my king, but I'm not living like that. And pleasant, who is miserable, takes piney and puny, and they move from God's house of bread, and they move to God's washpot. Doesn't sound like a good combination, does it? But as you look at that, you see the importance of that as it's unfolded. And these characters, as they're trying to find some way to have peace in life, but they're going the wrong direction. They're going away from what God has promised that he will do if they will turn back to him in the covenant relationship. And they're going to the enemies of God. They're going into the world. They're going into God's washpot. And there they expect to find peace. I don't think they ever meant to go and stay there. But if you just sort of walk through, you'll find that as they got there, that they were there they sojourned there is the word. It just meant that they went over there temporarily. And then it says that they stayed there. And then it says that they dwelt there. And then it says they were there for 10 years. So get this picture in your mind. Here is, God is my king. I'm not living like it though. And pleasant, but I'm miserable, taking puny and piney, and we're moving from God's washpot, and we're going from God's house of bread, and we're going to move to God's washpot. We won't stay long, but we stayed there 10 years, and before it's over with, they run from a famine, and they run into 3 funerals. Elimelech dies there, and both boys, they get married, and then both boys die there. So now you have where God is my king, but he didn't live that way. Pleasant, who is miserable, pining and puny, and they move over into God's wash pot, and they don't mean to stay there long, but they stay there, and they run from a famine, and they run to 3 funerals. You talk about miserable. To be out of the hand of God, out of the land of God, and be in a foreign land with the enemies, and in that day and time, 3 widows. There was no social justice. There was no social system. They were homeless. And so finally, Naomi comes to the place and says, you know what, I've heard that there's food back home. I'm going back home. Ophrah said, well, I can't go. But Naomi says, Ruth says to Naomi, I see something about you. And she gives this beautiful commitment. Where you go, I will go. Where you dwell, I will dwell. Your people will be my people. I see something about you that is different. Your God will be my God. And so you have these 2 women who come back in such a difficult day, and God brings them back to take care of them. God's always working behind the scenes, redemptively, even when we are not living like God is our King, even when we are living miserably, even whenever we complain, even when we run away, even when we get out of His will, God is always calling us back to Himself. God is always doing something to be able to work redemptively despite our disobedience. Romans 8:28 says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for the good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to His purpose. That does not mean that everything that happens is good, but it means that God takes that, and you cannot thwart the redemptive, gracious hand of God is working on your behalf. Maybe today you are a believer, but you're not living like God is my King. Maybe today your life is supposed to be pleasant, but you are miserable. Maybe spiritually you feel puny and pining. And today maybe you even feel like you are living right in the middle of God's wash pot. You feel like you are so far from home, you are so far from God, and that there's no hope for you. This morning this lesson teaches us that God is working in a way that He's going to bring redemption if we'll turn to Him. Let's look, if we think for just a minute, these 3 widows in this ancient land. Orpah goes back, she's out of the picture, and we enter into chapter 2, and another character is introduced. His name is Boaz. What a wonderful name, Boaz. But he is a great guy. We're going to learn that in the midst of this situation, God does some things, and there's some things that sound strange to our ears, some things that just don't quite translate into our culture. So you got to understand some customs that they have, that the principle that they share with us is still part of what we do. So if you will, look in chapter 2. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain from one in whose sight I may find favor. Under the law, God told them that they needed to take care of those who were in need, the needy. God's always had a plan. God's always been gracious, and God always means for people that He has blessed, and it's part of our responsibility to Him for us to be able to minister to people who are in need. I know as you translate that into our culture, sometimes in our culture, it's hard to find the people who really are in need. They didn't have Social Security. They didn't have food stamps. They didn't have any kind of social system, so God set it up. Let me read Leviticus 19, verses 9 and 10. He says, when you reap the harvest of your field, you shall not reap to the very corners of your field. Nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. Nor shall you glean from your vineyards and gather the fallen fruit. You shall leave them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. He said, if you're going to follow me, don't just clean the field. Don't get it from the corners. If you drop some, don't go back a second time and pick all that up. Don't pick it up, the grapes off the ground. There are folks who have need, and they're truly needy. We're supposed to help take care of them. And you may struggle with that. I know that I do, in the sense that sometimes in our day and time, there are folks who take advantage of a system that aren't really needy, But I can't really sort that out. That's not really, I'm not called to be the judge of that. I think you have to be wise and all that, but God means for us to take care of the needy. And that needs to be a part of our daily life. That needs to be something that we are sensitive to. If you stop and think about whenever in Galatians chapter 2, Paul is writing and he says, you know what, Peter and a group of were called to carry the gospel to the Jewish people, and I had been called and ordained to carry the gospel to the Gentiles. And whenever we met, we kind of agreed upon that in chapter 2 and verse 10. He said, whenever we agree that's what's going to happen, he says, they only ask us to remember the poor, the very thing I was also eager to do. That's part of what we're supposed to do. Now, I know that sometimes is hard, but I struggle with that as well. But that is part of my Christian responsibility. Matthew chapter 25 is still a passage that comes back to my mind almost every week. It's where Jesus says to them, the righteous will answer him and say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. And we are to let that be part of our Christian walk, that we are generous to help the needy. Now you're saying, preacher, now how can I do that? There's so many opportunities. I'm going to tell you how. This is a great opportunity, and we're in the midst of it right now. It is next Sunday, it's our global hunger emphasis. On Wednesday nights, starting this Wednesday night, you can come in on Wednesday night, and there's going to be little rice bowls that are sitting on the table. Global hunger is through the initiative of Southern Baptist. All the overhead is paid through our cooperative program. 100% of the money that is given. Next Sunday morning, we're going to take an offering. It's one of the offerings that we take as a church that goes to Global Hunger Offering. 100% of that money goes to buy food to give to needy people, to give to the hungry. 80% of that goes overseas. 20% of that is in the United States. And so everything that we give, that we as Southern Baptists say, this offering, everything that is given is going to go to buy food to be able to supply the needy. That is just one way. I think we ought to be sensitive to that every day, but that is something that we do together as Southern Baptists, and we can do so much more together than any of us can do alone. So God gives them this principle of generosity. Don't pick up everything in the field. And so Ruth goes to the field. And you know what? She just happened to be in the field of Boaz. And we come to chapter 2 and verse 3. And Boaz comes and look in verse 3. It says, and then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. He was of the family of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. Listen to these next words. Whenever he came to his reapers, to his workers, Boaz said, the Lord be with you. That was not just a flippant remark. That was something exceptional. The Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servants, who was in charge of the reapers, I don't know how you spell that, but that's what he said. He said, who is that? He sees Ruth. And so the foreman tells him the story. Well, she was with Naomi, and they were over in Moab. She's a Moabite. He tells the whole story. And so Boaz hears the story, and his heart is set on her to help her. And so look in verse 8. Boaz said to Ruth, he called her over and said, listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go from this one, and stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you, not to bother you. When you're thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? And Boaz replied to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord and the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. He gives her protection. He says nobody's going to bother you. Matter of fact, he gives her provisions because he told the workers, don't pick up everything. Don't just leave the scraps for her. Leave some of the best for her. So he is taking care of her. And here's the application for us, that sometimes we don't see God's hand at working. And we just happen upon the best, that we happen upon the first fruits. We happen upon some of the bounty and the good things. And we say, well, I'm just lucky. No, you're not. God is looking out for you. God is blessing you. And if you don't see that God put her in Boaz's field, and when we get to the end of the story, you'll see how God's taking care of her. God does the same thing for us. But if we don't see it, then we only see corn in the field. We don't see the blessing from heaven. So we have to see that. Even Joseph said to his brothers who sold him into slavery, his brothers who wanted him dead. But at the end of the story, Genesis chapter 15, verse 20, he said, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about the present result to preserve many lives. So whenever Ruth gets home, Naomi looks at her and says, my goodness, where have you been gleaning? What field have you been gleaning in? I'll not read them all, but whenever her mother-in-law asked her that, she said, I went to Boaz's field, and he was kind and generous to me. And she said, oh, Ruth, the Lord's taking care of us. And he's a near relative to us. So there's the principle of gleaning. Now let's move to the principle of the kinsman redeemer. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. The word kinsman redeemer, if you have New International Version, it's used 12 times in all of the Bible, and all of them are in the book of Ruth. But the Hebrew word is goel. It's used over 100 times, and usually it means nearest kinsman. And it means somebody who is doing something on behalf of somebody else. These are the people who will step up and take responsibility, and that they help somebody else. Maybe avenge a wrong that's done to somebody else. Or they buy a piece of property as a kinsman redeemer and take care of a man's family. This is kind of strange, so you're going to have to kind of think about different from us. In the Hebrew succession line of heirs, whenever they come into the promised land, they've got all the land that God's given them, and how does he divide that up? He divides it up into the 12 different tribes. Every tribe gets a certain portion of land, and every family in that tribe gets a portion of their land. And so that is their land. That is the promised land from God. Whenever they have their land, sometimes they go into difficult times like everybody else. They have personal tragedy. They have sickness in their family. They have difficulty with their crops, and they need to take out a loan. So they will go to somebody and they will sell their land. But in the Hebrew line of succession, selling the land is not really selling the land like we think of. It's more of what we think of as leasing the land. Because in their agricultural system, every 7 years they gave the land a Sabbath. They gave it a year of rest. They didn't cultivate it. They didn't pick up everything. God provided for them, but every 7 years, that is sound agricultural principles. So God told them every 7 years do that. And then Sabbath of Sabbath, every 7 sevens, every 49 years. At the end of that, the 50th year is the year of Jubilee. Not only did they have the agricultural application, but it meant that if they have through that time that they've had to sell a portion of their land, that at the end of the year of Jubilee, then the land went back to the original owners. Everything got put back like it started. And so whenever they would negotiate a price, it would kind of be based upon, well, how long am I going to get to use this land before the year of Jubilee? If it just happened, year of Jubilee, you've got it for 49 years. So you've got it for a generation. You're going to be able to use that land, so you're going to have to pay more for it. But if the year of Jubilee is next year, you're not going to pay full price just to use that land for a year. So you see, it is equitable in the sense that everybody gets restored. And yet, as they come to that point, then if they die, owning their land, then they pass that down. The line of succession is that a father would pass it on to his sons. The oldest son gets the biggest portion. If he doesn't have a son, then it goes to, and he takes care of his children, but it goes to his brother, his oldest brother. If the man dies and he doesn't have any sons alive and he doesn't have any brothers alive, then it goes to his uncle on his father's side, the oldest uncle. If he doesn't have a son, if he doesn't have a brother, if he doesn't have an uncle, then it goes to the closest relative. And all that relates to the kinsman redeemer. So if a man dies and he has his widow, but he doesn't have any children, then that land can be bought by the kinsman redeemer. And the kinsman redeemer, then, he has a responsibility to buy that land, and then along with that, he marries the widow. And in marrying the widow, if they don't have any children, then he fathers a child, and it's in the dead man's name. That is the dead man's son. So whenever the line of succession is passed on, when that land is passed on, then he passes it on out of his own pocket and out of his own worth, and he passes it on to the son that he's fathered in name of the dead man. So it is a complicated system. Well, that's kind of where we are in the book of Ruth. Now then, the oldest son, Elimelech's dead, his oldest son is dead, and now's the widow. And so Boaz is a near relative, but he is not the closest relative. Look there in chapter 3, all this unfolds. It's a strange custom, but then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you and dwell with you? Now is not Boaz our kinsman, and with whose maid that you were? Behold, the winnowing barley in the threshing floor. Wash yourself, therefore, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, go down to the threshing floor, and do not make yourself known until he's finished eating and drinking. And it shall be that when he lies down, you shall notice the place where he lies. Go and uncover his feet and lie down." What in the world is going on here? Whenever they find out that he has been gracious to her, he has given her protection, and he can be the kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer will buy the land. He will marry the widow. A son will be born, and that family line goes on. But here's the thing. Kinsman redeemer has to be of near relation. He has to be able to pay the redemption price. He has to be willing to pay the redemption price. But he can't just up and do that. He has to be asked to do that. So there's the requirement. I know this is a little technical, isn't it? But whenever you stop and you think how God has unfolded to bring this Moabite woman, and she's now about to have a kinsman redeemer, and God has worked this out, but how does that unfold? You don't go down to the courthouse and draw up a contract. You don't contact a lawyer. You have to make some kind of overture that says, "I want you to be my kinsman redeemer." And this is how she did. Whenever they're down threshing and willowing the product, then they stay on the threshing floor to guard the wheat or the barley. But it turns into a party. They were Baptists. They eat. And she said, "You wait until he goes to sleep. You see where he's laying, and then you go down." Sometimes people read this and say, "Oh, there's something fishy about that." There's nothing immoral goes on, nothing indecent that goes on. This is how she does it. She goes down and she humbles herself at his feet. And whenever he wakes up, he says, "Who is that?" And she said, it's Ruth. "And I want you to be my kinsman redeemer." And whenever he says, "I will do that, but there's one who's closer kin." So now we have another strange custom. The kinsman redeemer is set in place, and it shows us how to take responsibility. Now there's a principle to learn from here. And in our day and time, we are living in such a strange time. I want to make this point. There's an accountability with the kinsman redeemer. He is known for what he does. And he is asked to do that. And everything that Boaz did whenever she said, "I want you to be my kinsman redeemer," whenever she came and laid at his feet and asked that he would cover her with his wings, nothing of impropriety takes place there. She is wholesome. Verse 11, he said, all the people know you're an excellent woman. But there is something to be known. Whenever he goes to the city gates and he finds the man who is a closer kin to her, and he said, you know what, you could buy that land. And he said, oh, yeah, I think I will. And he said, but if you buy that land, there's also a widow involved. And you'll have to be her kinsman redeemer. And so you'll have a child in the name of the dead man, and that your land will pass on to him. He said, I can't afford that. And he says, but I will pass it on to you. And he takes off his sandal and he hands it to him at the city gate. That seems odd, doesn't it? You may remember a few years ago, President Bush was over in the Arab world, and there was a man that stood up, disrespected him, and he took his sandal off and threw at him. That's still a thing in the Arab world. That is the sign of disrespect. But for them, it was a sign of commitment. Whenever they're in the city gate, that's where everybody knew who you really are. That's where business was conducted. That's where everybody knew who was the honest one and who were the cheats. And whenever they came here and he confronted the near kin, and whenever he relinquished accountability, he took off his sandal and handed it to him, there was an accountability that came with that. Folks, there's a principle that goes to us. Yes, we need to learn the principle of generosity. We need to learn the principle of the kinsman redeemer, of accountability. And we need to learn about integrity. And we live in a day and a time when there's not a whole lot of that from public leaders and from folks who are standing at the city gates, and that we have dismissed that from our world. This last 2 weeks, let me just say, there are, and in light of the Me Too movement, there are victims. There are women and men, but mostly women, who have been victims of sexual assault and impropriety. And we should be the first ones to stand up and to say we want it done with integrity. We want to make sure if the authorities need to be called. And in the life of this church, there's been a time when we've had to look at even involving the authorities. I think that we need to be the first one. I work in a church that has a child care. The overwhelming majority of the people who work in child care are women. I have made it known to every woman. Our church staff, we have 2 church secretaries who are women. 2 of the ministerial staff are women. We want to stay above reproach. And so we make sure that if there's anything that happens that anybody feels uncomfortable, and we need to report it. And if we need to involve the authorities, we need to involve the authorities. I will be the first one to tell you, I would not hesitate. There doesn't need to be a cover-up. So, in our day and time, that's very strange. But there needs to be that city gate as well of taking accountability, handling the sandal, taking accountability. And for us, we have a generation that you're growing up in a very odd time, because these past 2 weeks they've gone back and made accusations about Judge Kavanaugh and things that went back to when he was in high school. And we live in a day that every picture that you take and that you post, it's still there, and it'll still be there 30 years from now. Everything that you tweet or that you write, there's a public record out there. There's an accountability. I know there's a lot of freedom, but in that freedom, there's an accountability. And the world is looking to see if we're going to live by our character, we're going to live by our faith or not. And everything that we do, whether that means you're 90 or 9, that the world is watching us. We live in a day that we stand at the city gates. Are we able to stand there for everybody to know who we are? Are we willing to pass off the accountability to say, I'm a man of my word? My grandpa, I don't know that he ever signed a contract or a piece of paper. There was a symbol. He stuck out his hand, and whoever he agreed with, he shook their hand. That meant something. Now then, even signing your name for a lot of people doesn't mean anything. But whenever you enter into an agreement, it is your word. Are you building your character? There's a lot to be said as you turn and you find that as he becomes her kinsman redeemer, she becomes his wife. They have a child, a little boy, and Naomi's holding the little boy, and everybody says, oh my goodness, God truly has blessed you. She's pleasant again. And this little boy, you know who he is? He turns out to be the grandfather of David. How did God take a Moabite girl and bring her into a kinsman redeemer and set the course for all of eternity for the Messiah to be our kinsman redeemer? I know this is a complicated story, but let me share with you just some practical lessons. Number one, surrender to the sovereignty of God. Don't think that you are where you are and that there's no hope. God has a plan, and if you will turn to Him and follow His plan, God has a plan. You follow Him, and He will bless you. And God will use, even in bad situations, that all things will work together for the good to those who love God and who are the called. You find courage even in this crazy world. God's still king. The second lesson that we learn is cultivate your character. Naomi, you see this woman who looked to God when everybody else around her was bowing to Baal. And she said, I'm going to go back home. And I'm going back to the Lord. And she gave counsel to Ruth, and God blesses her. You see Ruth, a woman who had no reason to be able to be loyal, but she shows character by being loyal to Naomi. And God unfolds a plan, and God uses her that she's even in the line and lineage of Jesus Himself. You find a woman of integrity in how she deals with Boaz. Boaz is a man who is a God-centered man. He has built his character. I would encourage you that reputation is what everybody else thinks about you. It's good to have a good reputation. But character is what you do when nobody's watching, when there's nobody that sees what you're doing. Are you cultivating your character? Are you building your character? The third lesson is when you feel your heart drifting, Christians, when you feel like you're wandering away from God, when you feel like you're going over into Moab, then deal with it. Don't just keep wandering into Moab and sojourn there and stay there. You're going to die there. When you feel your heart going into Moab, then deal with that. Ralph Waldo Emerson said, sow a thought and you will reap an action. Sow an action, you'll reap a habit. Sow a habit and you'll reap a character. Sow a character and you'll reap your destiny. Don't let your destiny be that you stay away from God just because it's inconvenient, because you don't want to do anything about it. When you feel your heart drifting, then deal with it. And whenever you find yourself in Moab, then turn back to the Lord. In chapter 1 and verse 6, after her husband and her sons are dead, it says that Naomi looked back and she said, I hear that God's blessing, and she turns her heart toward the things of God, back toward the land of God. But then it says in verse 7, she got up and she went. The prodigal son, there he was in the midst of the pigsty, wanting to eat the husk that the swine did eat. And it says he came to himself, and he said, I'll arise and go to my father's house and say, my goodness, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Hire me as your servant. But he didn't just think about it. It says, and he arose and came to his father. And we can sit in a service like this, and we can think about how good God has been, and we can think about, well, my life's not what it ought to be, and we can think about, maybe I'm even in Moab. What should I do about it? You need to do something about it. You need to turn back to the Lord. You need to get up, and you need to come home. That's what God is calling us to. So build your character, and then finally, receive the Redeemer. The Redeemer is close to us. He left heaven, was born in a little place called Bethlehem. He is able to pay the price. He is willing to pay the price, but we have to receive Him. If you're here today and you never trusted Jesus, today receive the redemption that He offers. Let's pray.